Hello and welcome to this special edition of the Climate Clock, a show where we discuss everything sustainability and climate change. And today on the show, we have a special guest joining us, Mark Watts, who is the Executive Director at C40 Cities. They talk about execution and changes at the local level because that's where the real change starts before we get macro as well. Mark, such a pleasure to have you with us on the show today. And there's so much happening, such exciting things that we saw in 2024, and 2025 also is something that we are watching out for. But you've come to India. You're in Delhi right now. So tell us what have the plans been? What other plans have you launched? The proposals as well, and what's the vision 2025 looking like?
Well, delighted to be on the show. Thank you so much for having me. I'm here in Delhi. We're just launching, in fact, a program called Lane Shift. So it's a collaboration with both the city here and with a whole load of private sector actors to take the emissions out of freight deliveries. So what we were announcing today is a trialing of a large electric freight truck that is going to be doing the golden quadrilateral around India to sort of test how that works. Is it possible with a big electric truck, and what infrastructure would need to be put in place to make that really commercially viable? But then also on a route from Bengaluru to Chennai, 20 different sized electric trucks carrying real loads for a number of companies that have signed up to be part through the Climate Pledge, which is an initiative launched by Amazon, the big e-commerce company, in partnership with C40 to really test what we can do around electric freight.
That is interesting. So, I just wanted you to tell us more about what C40's plans are when it comes to the 2025 vision. How many countries or cities do you have right now under C40 Cities currently? Do you plan to add more? Where does India stand when it comes to, your ground proposals and your plans?
So C40, we're a network of just under 100. 100 is actually the sort of limit of our membership, of the biggest cities in the world, the most influential cities. They represent over 600 million people, about a quarter of global GDP, and they've come together in an alliance to drive forward faster, more inclusive climate action in those cities. And we can see it's working. Our latest figures for last year, 82% of our member cities are cutting their emissions faster than their respective nation states. So what we hope to show in 2025 is really that dynamism, that leadership at a city level. It's where most people in the world now live. It's where 3/4 of global carbon emissions happen. But that leadership at a city level really can be at the forefront of driving the whole world economy towards being clean and green. And we've got to nearly halve global emissions by 2030. Indian cities, really important part of our network. 5 member cities here that are particularly showing leadership around vehicle electrification, as I've just been talking about on freight electrification, which is a relatively new thing, but also real big advances in electric buses in cities like Mumbai. A lot of leadership, I'd say, at the governance level in India. It's been interesting. We've been piloting something called climate budgeting, which is where a city authority commits that it will marry the annual financial budget process to the annual carbon budget. So essentially, that you'll only spend the city's public money if you can show that it's going to help deliver the climate target. That's both about improving resilience, so adapting to the impacts of climate change, as well as cutting emissions. And that's something that a number of cities in India are now piloting and really leading the world on. And I guess, the last thing here in India is, with the impacts of climate breakdown being so severe, we're really seeing a lot of leadership and a lot of thought about how you change the way that cities develop so that they can cope with extreme flooding, with heat and humidity, particularly in a place like India where lots of people work outdoors.
Yes, population, weather change, climate change, and the tropical environment, a lot of things that we need to consider, right? Because that is when you can make those local level changes that are required as well. Interestingly, you spoke about climate budget, and Mumbai is one of the cities that came up with a climate budget, right? The municipal corporation came out with that. Let's talk more about that, not just specifically Mumbai budget, but how can local governments bring about the change? And the number of cities that you already have in India, do you plan to add more on that? And within those cities itself, which community or which corporation has impressed you the most so far, Mark?
Well, we're not planning to add members necessarily. So the way C40 works is we try and stay at a club of about 100, and it's sort of equally distributed across the major regions of the world. And we have very tough leadership standards. So to be in C40, you've got to really be a climate leader. You've got to have a Paris Agreement compliant, so that the agreement that all the countries have made, compliant climate action plan, and show that you're delivering on it year on year to stay a member. And cities that don't meet those standards sometimes lose their membership. What we are trying to do, though, is increasingly work with C40s that are not members of C40, but are in the same region as some of our member cities. So I think there's 40-something cities in the Maharashtra state, for example, that we've been supporting to introduce climate plans in the last couple of years. So science-based, data-driven local government. We now like to move on to be looking also at climate budgeting. And the reason I think that is so important, it's not that local government can solve the climate crisis. We absolutely need nation states to lead on the really big changes like investing in renewable energy. But we reckon across the C40 cities, about half of all the changes that need to happen for people living in cities can be delivered either through a city government or in partnership, using that soft power of city government to work with the private sector, work with civil society. And that's exactly what we're seeing with the Lane Shift initiative. Which, I mean, I'm really excited. It's got a number of different cities in C40 involved, but particularly on that route from Bengaluru, Chennai, where here we've got a partner of e-commerce companies like Amazon. We've got companies that manufacture electric freight vehicles. And then we've got the sort of logistical companies that are often working with those who need to distribute freight, along with the city government. So we look at the combination of regulations, the profit motive, and of course the investment that's needed. What's the kind of right price at which there'll be a rapid shift, in the same way that we've seen with electric buses, into electric freight vehicles.
Okay, so Mark, is it fair to say that the 2025 vision or the outlook for C40, or the first priority for C40, would be a lot about green mobility? What are some of the other aspects that you're looking at, or something that requires immediate attention and can be solved at the earliest?
Well, green mobility, absolutely, because it's where a lot of emissions are. But also, if you look in the waste sector, methane emissions, which are a very fast-acting greenhouse gas, and relatively easy to deal with if we can, first of all, capture the methane that comes out of landfills where organic matter is being put in the ground as waste. Then you can very quickly reduce those methane emissions to almost zero at relatively low costs, but in the longer term, put in waste systems that collect that waste and reuse it so that it's for compost or for energy. I think increasingly our work then is also about looking to the future. So how do we design cities so that they are both more comfortable places to live, so can cope with higher temperatures, perhaps lower amounts of water, so lots of trees and shading. I loved the way that the Commissioner of Mumbai talked about wanting to have a forest with buildings in it as the ideal for how Mumbai would be in the future. And more generally adapting our cities to cope with the climate breakdown that is going to happen whatever we do with emissions in the future, because at the moment our climate is changing on the basis of the emissions we put up in the past 10 or 20 years.
And that's interesting, right? A forest with buildings instead of buildings with forest, because we need to think the other way. It cannot be just that we have some buildings put up and maybe 2 or 3 trees out there. That's the way to think about it now. Your thoughts first on COP29, and how can C40 cities come together? What is the agenda to make COP30 successful? Because there has been a dissatisfactory tone after COP29 across the major stakeholders.
Well, COP29 achieved the absolute minimum that it needed to do, having an agreement between the nation states parties to create a new climate fund so that the wealthiest countries in the world that have done the most to cause the climate crisis put money in a pot that can be used by the currently least wealthy countries who've done so little to cause the climate crisis, but are feeling the biggest effects of it. $300 billion. It sounds a lot of money, but it's absolutely nowhere near what's needed. We estimate just for cities, we need $800 billion per year of just public finance by 2030. I've got much more optimism about COP30 in Brazil next year. We've seen from the Brazilian government, they've been one of the first countries to bring forward a new, much enhanced national climate commitment, so-called NDC. It's got tougher emission reduction targets in it, on the back of having a lot of success under President Lula in the last 2 years in reducing the rate of deforestation of the Amazon, the sort of lungs of the whole of the earth. But perhaps critically for our work at C40, Brazil has built into its climate plan the notion of climate federalism, so that they will deliver all of the action in the national plan in a collaboration between the federal government, the states and regions, and city governments. And they've set up a presidential commission to achieve that, along with a well-funded green resilient cities program that in the first instance is doing things like funding the more rapid rollout of electric buses and indeed defense against climate impacts in Brazil. So I think with that kind of leadership, with that kind of focus, we can see a change to the way that these annual gatherings, these COPs work. They need to move away from a complete focus on negotiation, which hasn't produced that many significant outcomes, let's face it, in the last 30 years, and more onto implementation. And we're making an offer from the C40 cities that will help kickstart that process to make COPs from now on that they should begin with the parties, and let's start with cities, but then move to national governments in the future. First of all, just publicly showing what did they deliver in the previous year, how did they do against the plans that they've got, and then setting out what they'll do for the next year, not promises for 20 or 30 years in the future, what they're going to do for the next year, and then look to partners to help deliver more significant climate action in the future.
All right, take that point. Good luck for the future plans, and let's just achieve what we need to achieve for the better of the planet as well, right? It's the need of the hour, and good to have these conversations and these proposals that you've set out. May they all be successful. Thank you so much, Mark, for joining in today and having this conversation with CNBC TV18.
Thank you so much.
Okay, all right. With that, we'll take your leave on this edition of Climate Clock, but do stay tuned for more news and updates.